You ever have a camera and take pictures, or if you have a phone that has a camera in it, you know that you can have varying levels of zoom. You can take a very narrow-in picture, or you can get a wide angle. With a camera phone, you can actually get a whole panorama, right, where you scan across a whole scene and get like the whole horizon. And when you take those pictures, you get different perspectives. So if I were to show you a zoomed-in picture of someone with tears flowing down their face, what would that tell you? Does it have to mean they're sad? Or does the context make a difference? So if I zoom back and the rest of the picture is a funeral, then the tears are tears of sadness. What if I zoom back and it's someone standing in front of a whole crowd of people and someone's handing them an award? What kind of tears are those? Joy, happiness, right? Maybe surprise. What if I zoom back and it's a gym or someplace on a military base and families are being reunited with their service member loved ones who have just come back from deployment? Then what are those tears? Happiness, but also probably the breaking of the anxiety and all that goes with it, right? There's a lot going on there. So the big picture makes a difference. Every Sunday when we gather, how many Bible texts do we read out loud? The Psalms are in the Bible, so that's 4, right? And those are always some narrow picture. It's a piece of a passage. It's never a whole chapter. It's never a whole book. It's not the whole Bible. So we have a zoomed-in picture. And sometimes I think we forget that we can take a step back and see what the bigger context is. So the first text we hear today is from Jeremiah. Surely the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will raise up this shoot from Jesse, and this person will bring righteousness and justice to the world. Is that good news? Yes. Well, if you take a step back, though, in the gospel or in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet, Jeremiah is a prophet at a time when an army has gathered around and is going to tear down the city wall of Jerusalem, tear down the temple, carry away all the people that have any kind of means to Babylonia, and leave behind the poor people to fend for themselves in a city that has just been destroyed. That's terrible. And in the midst of real terrible destruction and war and killing and all the rest of it, the prophet stands up and says, surely the days are coming when, says the Lord, that righteousness and justice is going to happen. Does that give those words a little bit more context and bite in terms of their promise? I hope so, right? And so you take that step back. Psalm. Today we read part of Psalm 25. And my favorite part of it, in the translation in the hymnal, it says that God's compassion and love are from everlasting. How long is that? Forever, right? It's before any of us can imagine, it'll last longer than we can. In the NRSV, it says that God's mercy and steadfast love are from of old. And I just love that turn of phrase. I can read that over and over. But you take a step back and read the whole psalm, and the psalmist is pleading with God to teach them God's paths, which means that there are lots of paths, and not all those paths are good paths, but all of God's are good. And the psalmist is in the midst of treachery and enemies and pain and struggle, and in the midst of all that can say, teach me your paths, because your love and compassion, your mercy and steadfast love are from forever. So take me to that place. Then we go to Thessalonians, and we hear this passage today where Paul is writing to them and says, I give thanks for every time we pray and think of you for the joy that you have given us. Paul and his companions as they do ministry. He bounced around from community to community and started churches and checked back in with them, and he is praying for them. And it's this wonderful little prayer of growth for them, that they may grow in love and have strength, and that they may be able to be reunited again. But again, if you take a step back, all of this is happening within a time of persecution of the church. Paul was arrested and imprisoned, multiple times, and as he's writing this letter, it's in that backdrop of not just people talking bad about the church, but really physically persecuting the church. So this prayer for growth and love and thanksgiving happens within this sort of rough place of persecution. Then we get to the gospel text, and it already doesn't sound good from the beginning. Jesus says there's going to be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and there's going to be people fainting from fear and foreboding, and nations in an uproar. That all sounds bad. If you back up a little bit, you see that Jesus promises that the church will be persecuted, and it's more bad, right? events in the earth that are going to happen, and it's all of that. But in the midst of all of that, what does Jesus tell them to do? Raise up your heads because your redemption is near. Is that good news? Yes. So all of these passages, all four of them, in their narrow sense, has some good news about God's grace coming into the world. It's only when you step back that you see that all of them are happening within, not just like, I had a bad day, kind of bad, but horrible, terrible death, destruction, and violence in the world. So that these messages we get that sound like good news, they sound like promises. Surely the day is coming when the Lord is going to do this stuff. And they sound like a story of God about mercy and compassion, and about joy, and about redemption. All of that is set within terrible things that are happening. Now, today we begin a new church year. The first season of the church year is Advent. And so today we have a narrow focus. Advent. But if I take a step back, what's the next season of the church year? Christmas, which is followed by Epiphany, which is followed by Lent, which is followed by Easter, and then Pentecost. And each of those seasons has its own sort of purpose. Advent is about expectation and hope and looking for the coming of Jesus. Christmas is about Jesus showing up. Epiphany is where we start to tell the stories of Jesus becoming the Jesus that we know. Lent is where we turn and look at our own brokenness as humans that ends at the cross. And on Good Friday, but then Easter, we get resurrection, right? And then Pentecost is the birthday of the church, and the whole season of Pentecost is about how we become the church and continue to be a part of that story. Now, when we focus in on just Advent, we can talk about hope and expectation about Jesus coming, but if you forget about the whole rest of that big panorama where Jesus ends in his death and then you get resurrection, right, it loses a little bit of context. I have to tell you that Advent is probably just in the last few years become my favorite season of the church year. I think it should probably be Easter because of the resurrection bit, but it's become Advent. And it's become Advent because I had a conversation with somebody a few years back, and their question was, we haven't done Advent yet this year. How's it going to be different? Because, right, we come around to these things, and if we just come around and narrowly say it's time to do Advent, it's time to talk about hope and expectation, right? But take a step back and say, why is it different? And the question we landed on was, where do we need Jesus to show up? Because if Christmas is about Jesus showing up, if Easter is about Jesus being raised and bringing us new life, and if we're going to keep going around this story again, every time we come around to Advent, we ought to ask, where do we need Jesus to show up? And it would be nice to have Jesus to show up in our places of celebration, sure. But if we really ask that question, do we answer it with celebration or do we answer it with the hard stuff? Hard stuff. That's where we need Jesus to show up. So when we're in those narrow places of grief, and it might be the narrowness of depression where you can't even get out of bed. It might be a relationship that seems like it's unsalvageable and is ending in divorce. It might be that we have health things that are terminal or just chronic and we can't seem to get out of the pain and the struggle. It might be that we feel discounted because of who we are for whatever reason that is. And when we're in those places, that's where we need Jesus to show up. So Advent then is not some like pre-Christmas celebration where we start singing Christmas songs early to make sure we sing all the ones we like and get there. Advent is its own thing, and its question is, where do we need Jesus to show up? And if we're honest about that, it gets pretty dark. It gets pretty dark pretty quick. And that's where we end up, where we can be in those narrow spaces. And when we have a narrow field of view, it's very easy for the two things Jesus talks about to take hold, fear and foreboding. It's the same thing the psalmist is wrestling with, by the way. Lead me down your paths, Lord, instead of the paths of fear and foreboding. Do we get told to be afraid a lot in our culture? All the time. But we also get told to pretend like it's not that bad. I was thinking about when I was a kid and I went to baseball games. There was the guys that said beer here, but then there were cotton candy people. So we got people that say there's fear here, but then there's cotton candy. Does cotton candy have any healthy calories? I don't need it. I don't know. I'm just asking. So on the one hand, we can be led to that fear and foreboding, and on the other hand, we can just be told it's not that bad, pretend like it's okay. And that's just really empty optimism. And Advent is about neither one of those things. It's not about being afraid. although there are things to be afraid of. And it's not about empty optimism. It's about real, actual hope and expectation that something new can happen. So that when Jesus says, raise up your heads, your redemption is near, that is not empty optimism, because it's based on a story that he knows is going to end in new life. And when he says be alert, it's not be afraid alert, it's be anticipatory alert. Like the sun's going to rise and it's going to be beautiful, so you're paying attention and ready for that to happen. Now all of this though happens, and I think Jesus gives us this sense of a bigger story, because it's very easy to get stuck in those narrow visions of where we're at. Whatever those bad things are, that grief, that depression, that struggle, when we just see that, it can seem like we can never get outside of it. But if you take the wide-angle view, which is what we get this morning across these Bible texts, it's what Jesus gives us in his journey. If you take the wide-angle view, we get a different story. We don't only just have the tough stuff, we have the promise. Surely the days are coming. A promise that was spoken in the worst of the worst times for a community of people. And that promise is that God is going to bring justice and righteousness. Well, what does that look like? Well, the psalmist tells us that of old, from everlasting, it has looked like love and mercy and compassion. So when we think about that promise, and when all these bad things are happening, and what can God do that is new, what God is going to do is what God has always done, which is love and mercy and compassion. Then we get to the gospel. I'm going to skip Thessalonians. When we get to the gospel, and Jesus is saying, and when is that going to happen, right? Surely the days are coming, and it's going to be about love and compassion. And Jesus says, when it's as bad as it can get, that's when God does God's best work. So that's when you should pay attention and look for the new thing that God is going to do. And what's that new thing look like? Love and compassion that has been from of old, and it's the promise that God has brought. Now, when you take this whole panorama of a story, right? We have these narrow visions of things not going great. We step back and see this whole panorama. God's not done yet. We can talk about the prophet Jeremiah, who's long gone, and we can talk about the psalmist and their trust in God, and we can talk about what Jesus is saying, and he says it's all going to already have happened. But my favorite part about this whole thing is Paul. Because Paul is looking at a church of people who he says in his prayer that they still have some growth to do. Right? We're going to show up and we're going to shore up their faith where it's lacking. But the thing that he says they bring him is what? Joy. Joy. We thank you for your joy. You give us joy. So when you take this bigger picture and say we have a promise and we have this sense of mercy and compassion and love that is God, and we should keep our heads up, all of that carries us out into the world so that we can be the church of the Thessalonians that brings joy into people's lives. Not because we created it, but because it's been there of old, and it's part of who God is. When you take that big step back in Jeremiah, before you get to the passage we heard today, God says the city's going to be a place of joy. It's not right now, but the promise is that the days are coming when it will be. So we take these steps back and we get immersed in this whole of a story that is about promise and mercy and love, keeping our heads up so that we can take joy out into the world, because it's the gift that God has given us to carry, this good news of Jesus, right? And that's where that joy comes from. Now, when we gather here on a Sunday, we practice. Everything we do here is practice for this whole panorama of a story. When we confess and do forgiveness, right? Talk about that. That's about living in that forever mercy and compassion and love. When we sing the Kyrie and ask for God to have mercy, we're asking for that stuff to come alive, for that promise to come true. When we sing the hymn of praise, we're saying that same prayer God has, that Paul has for the Thessalonians, that growth and stuff might happen. When we get gathered around the spot, it's about the promise. When we gather around the table, it is about this new life that Jesus has given us. And when we gather around that table, I can never forget a time when I was an intern that we had a pastoral care meeting every week. And we would talk about people that needed care. And there was a woman who had been treated for cancer multiple times. And one Monday they sat down the meeting and they said, she's decided with this recurrence she's not going to get treated anymore. This she's done. And you knew that she was relatively close to death. And that Sunday, I was one of the communion servers, and I came around the rail, and how do you suppose she was kneeling at the rail? Head up, right? When it's as bad as it could get for her, head up. to receive this gift of grace, right? This whole story that starts with a promise that lives in this love and compassion, it ends in us sharing joy with the world, and there's this part of heads up. So I don't know if any of you noticed this. One of my professors, Mark Allen Powell, I think it was in his book, Loving Jesus, talked about the seminary worship space where there was like a big window up top. And in this text today it says, when the Son of Man comes, it's going to be on a cloud. And there was a point in worship where he said he always looked up out the window with some expectation. Did any of you expect Jesus to come in on a cloud today? No, right? So you probably haven't noticed this, maybe. But because he shared that story, every time I stand at this table, we sing a song, and it goes, holy, holy, holy. And then there's a part that says, Hosanna in the highest. We don't really have any windows you can see outside, so Jesus could be flying around in a cloud right now all around us, and we would have no idea. But I look up to the very farthest part, top peak of there, when we say Hosanna in the highest. And the reason I do that is because my professor talks about continuing to have this posture where we look and expect Jesus to show up. Where we keep our heads up because that redemption is near. Where we have an expectation that Jesus says is actually showing up. And I think what that practice does for us in this place is that when we gather around this table, we begin to actually believe and understand that those promises, that surely the days are coming, is that they may already be here. And that promise of mercy and steadfast love and compassion being from of old is actually true. And that we actually do have this gift of joy that we can take with us. So we practice in this place to keep our heads up, and then we carry that joy out into the world so that other people who are in those places where they just can't see past the suffering can see this bigger picture of love and grace and know that it is for them and know that it is true. And maybe in seeing our heads up, they too can lift their heads up and know that their redemption is near. Amen.